Siberia is a land where the wind bites with merciless cruelty, where the snow drifts like endless white waves over a terrain that seems almost otherworldly in its isolation. For months on end, the sun barely rises above the horizon, casting the frozen forests, jagged mountains, and ice-locked rivers into a dim, gray twilight that feels eternal. This is not a land for the faint of heart, nor for those who cling to warmth and comfort. It is a place where survival is a daily battle, where the weak perish unnoticed, and only the most cunning, most ruthless, and most resourceful can endure the unforgiving cold. It is in this vast, frozen wilderness that some of the darkest legends of human savagery were born, stories that would chill even the hardiest of souls. Among these tales, the legend of a cannibalistic warlord tribe stands out, a tribe whose terrifying reputation was whispered across settlements, and whose horrific practices of devouring the enemy during the harshest winters became both a method of survival and an instrument of fear. In the remote corners of Siberia, long before any official record could capture their deeds, there existed tribes that lived at the edge of human endurance. They were nomadic, their lives dictated by the seasons, by the availability of game, and by the unrelenting cruelty of nature itself. To outsiders, their customs might have seemed barbaric, grotesque, even unthinkable, but within the logic of survival in this frozen expanse, they were rules of life and death. Every winter, when the rivers froze and the snow deepened to knee or chest height, food became scarce. Starvation was a constant companion, and hunger drove people to extremes. It was in this context that the most infamous warlord of the Siberian wilderness rose, a leader whose cunning and cruelty would cement a legacy of terror and whose name would become synonymous with fear. This warlord's tribe was unlike any other in the region. They were fierce, disciplined, and bound by rituals that outsiders could scarcely comprehend. Their raids were swift and brutal, their tactics precise, and their acts of violence carried out with an almost ritualistic reverence. The most horrifying of these practices, however, was the consumption of enemy chiefs during the dead of winter. To an outsider, this act might seem grotesque and senseless, yet for the tribe, it was layered with meaning, an assertion of dominance, a spiritual act, a warning to anyone who might dare oppose them. Capturing an enemy chief alive was not enough. To survive, to assert control, to ensure the tribe's continued supremacy, the warlord demanded that the defeated leaders be ritually devoured. It was a horrifying demonstration of power, one that etched fear into the hearts of allies and adversaries alike. The origins of this practice are shrouded in mystery, blending fragments of history with whispers of myth. Some historians suggest it was born from extreme necessity. The brutal winters left little room for mercy, and consuming the flesh of the enemy provided sustenance in a landscape where starvation was the norm. Others argue that it was a calculated psychological weapon, designed to intimidate rivals and enforce obedience within the tribe. Regardless of the motive, the result was the same. Tales of this warlord's deeds spread across villages, carried by terrified travelers, muttered around dim fires, and preserved in oral legends that would outlast generations. Parents warned their children to behave, telling them that the warlord's eyes were everywhere, that those who crossed his path rarely returned. Every shadow in the forest could be a scout, every howl a signal of approaching death. The tribe's fearsome reputation became a tool as powerful as any weapon they carried. Yet even as their actions chilled the blood of those who heard of them, there was a strange fascination with the tribe, a grim curiosity that drew outsiders to their stories. Scholars, explorers, and traders who managed to survive encounters with the tribe described scenes of unimaginable horror. Enemy chiefs bound and displayed before fires, the ritualistic ceremonies that preceded the feast, the haunting silence of the snow-covered forests punctuated by the screams of the captured. And yet, they also noted a strange order within the chaos, a method to the madness, a code that governed who would live and who would die, who would be spared and who would be sacrificed. To the tribe, these were not acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were the rituals of survival, the unyielding rules of life at the edge of human endurance. The warlord himself remains a figure both feared and enigmatic. Few could claim to have seen him directly, and those who did survived only by luck or by demonstrating unwavering loyalty. He was a master strategist, understanding not only the harsh landscape, but also the minds of those he ruled and those he conquered. He cultivated a presence that was both magnetic and terrifying, a man whose very appearance could silence a village, and whose reputation preceded him like a shadow that darkened every horizon. His leadership was not merely about brute force. It was about psychology, spectacle, and the art of terror. By turning violence into ritual, by merging fear with tradition, he ensured that his influence extended far beyond the limits of his tribe's numbers or weapons. As winter pressed on and the rivers froze solid, the land became both his stage and his weapon. The warlord's enemies, trapped in the unyielding cold, were rendered powerless. The forest became an arena of survival, where cunning, strength, and a willingness to embrace horrors that others could not contemplate determined who would live and who would perish. It is here, in the endless white wilderness where the line between survival and atrocity blurred, that the legend of the Cannibal Warlord was forged, a story of power, terror, and the extremes to which humanity can go when pushed to its limits. The frozen lands of Siberia, silent and beautiful from a distance, conceal the darkness that few dared to witness and even fewer lived to describe. And it is from these dark, blood-stained legends that our tale begins. The warlord's story did not begin with terror, but with survival. Born in one of the most remote regions of Siberia, he was a child of snow and wind, of endless white plains and forests that groaned under the weight of winter. His earliest memories were of hunger and cold, of rivers that froze before the fish could be caught, and of the constant, brutal struggle to keep his family alive. In those formative years, he learned that mercy was a weakness, and that cunning, ferocity, and an unyielding will were the only currencies in this frozen realm. Even as a boy, he was neither cruel nor kind. He was simply a product of necessity, molded by a land that demanded ruthlessness. Where other children played, he hunted. Where others laughed, he watched, learned, and remembered. Every slight, every insult, every perceived threat was catalogued in his mind, a mental ledger that would one day shape the actions of a man whose name would strike fear into entire tribes. From a young age, the boy displayed a keen intelligence that set him apart from his peers. He understood the patterns of animals and men alike, the rhythms of the forests, and the weaknesses in those who thought themselves invincible. He learned to track silently, to anticipate movements, to exploit vulnerabilities before they could be defended. These were skills not merely for hunting, but for domination. His elders observed him closely, recognizing a spark that could either bring glory or destruction to their people. They taught him the rites of the tribe, the sacred ceremonies, the secret codes of loyalty, the rituals that bound the community together, but he absorbed these lessons in his own way, interpreting them through the lens of strategy and power. By adolescence, he had already begun to carve a path that would one day lead him to command not just respect, but fear. Violence became a language he spoke fluently. Early skirmishes with rival children, then with neighboring clans, tested his cunning and resolve. He learned that the smallest display of cruelty could shift power in his favor, that a well-timed act of brutality could inspire obedience and silence dissent. It was not mindless savagery. It was calculated, precise, and terrifying in its efficiency. Tales of his early exploits spread through local villages, whispered among traders and hunters, already painting a portrait of a young man whose presence demanded attention and whose wrath would be unforgiving. With each raid, each victory, his legend grew, and the seeds of his future dominion were sown. The tribe itself was a crucible in which his abilities could flourish. Leadership was never granted lightly in these harsh northern lands. It had to be earned, tested, and proven. Elders evaluated strength, cunning, and strategic insight, while peers gauged loyalty, bravery, and ruthlessness. The young warlord excelled in every arena. He was decisive when hesitation would have meant death, ruthless when mercy would have been weakness, and charismatic when he needed to unite his people. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already demonstrated a capacity for leadership that few could challenge. His reputation was bolstered not only by his victories, but by his understanding of human nature. He knew fear was as powerful as any weapon, and he wielded it like a sword, carefully calibrated to maintain obedience without inciting rebellion. Yet it was not mere intelligence or bravery that elevated him. It was vision. The young warlord imagined a future where his tribe would not merely survive the merciless winters, but dominate the region, feared and respected by every neighboring clan. He recognized that raw strength alone would not achieve this. Strategy, ritual, and terror were equally essential. He began to plan raids not as simple acts of survival, but as statements of power, ceremonies that would cement his authority and demonstrate to friend and foe alike that defiance would be met with unthinkable consequences. Each attack was choreographed with meticulous care, from the timing dictated by snowstorms to the selection of targets whose demise would send the strongest message. In these acts, he was both a warrior and a strategist, a man shaping his destiny in a land where survival often depended on preying upon the weak, the unprepared, or the unlucky. The psychological aspect of his rise cannot be overstated. He was acutely aware of how fear could be cultivated and maintained. Stories of his brutality were shared before the events themselves, whispered warnings that froze hearts in anticipation. Villagers learned that to oppose him was not merely to risk death, it was to risk being made an example, to have one's name and body entwined in legend as a warning to others. Within the tribe, he commanded unwavering loyalty, blending respect and terror in equal measure. Even those who might have questioned him understood that obedience was safer than defiance. He cultivated an aura of inevitability, a sense that his victory and dominance were preordained, and in doing so, he ensured that opposition was both rare and ineffective. By the time the warlord took full control of his tribe, he had already transformed from a cunning youth into a formidable leader. He combined strategic brilliance, psychological insight, and a willingness to embrace horrors that others could not conceive. His rise was neither accidental nor sudden. It was the result of years of observation, adaptation, and calculated action. Every childhood hardship, every early skirmish, every small act of cruelty and cunning had been a stepping stone toward the command he would one day wield. In a land where only the ruthless survive, he had not merely survived. He had mastered the rules of life and death, positioning himself as the central figure in a story that would soon plunge the frozen forests of Siberia into terror. The warlord's emergence was not just the story of a single man, but of a transformation, a transition from boy to predator, from survivor to master of fear. It was in this crucible of ice, starvation, and relentless struggle that the legend began to take shape, a legend that would be remembered for generations, whispered in fearful awe, and recorded as one of the darkest tales of human history. His rise was the prelude, a careful, chilling build-up to the acts of horror and domination that would define his name and haunt the icy wilderness long after his reign had begun. When winter gripped the Siberian wilderness, the landscape became both ally and adversary, a frozen expanse that could swallow the unwary or sharpen the instincts of the prepared. It was during these months, when rivers froze solid and the forests lay silent under layers of snow, that the warlord's raids became most feared. His campaigns were no mere acts of survival. They were displays of strategic genius, meticulously timed and executed with deadly precision. Scouts moved silently through the snow, leaving barely a trace of their passage, while the warlord observed from the shadows, calculating each move, predicting the enemy's reactions. Villages that thought themselves secure behind walls of timber and ice often found their defenses insufficient against a leader who understood not just brute force, but fear itself. Each raid was choreographed, each attack deliberate, and each act of violence designed to terrorize both the victim and the surrounding communities. The victims were most often rival tribes, leaders whose authority rivaled or threatened his own. Capturing a chief alive was both a practical and symbolic objective. The act itself required cunning, planning, and audacity. Traps were laid in the forest, false trails created to mislead pursuers, and ambushes sprung at the precise moment when the enemy least expected it. By the time the warlord's forces arrived, the opposition was already disoriented, exhausted, and vulnerable. To those who survived the initial encounter, the sight of their leader taken, bound and displayed before the tribe was enough to break morale entirely. The warlord understood that the psychological impact of such acts could eclipse the immediate benefits of physical conquest. It was not merely about killing enemies. It was about establishing dominance, creating a legend, and ensuring that stories of terror spread like wildfire through the frozen forests. Once captured, the ritual began. The ceremonial aspect of these feasts was as important as the act of consumption itself. Chiefs were displayed in public before fires, their hands bound, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies symbols of both defiance and submission. The tribe gathered to witness the proceedings, observing the rites with a mixture of reverence and dread. The warlord led these ceremonies with calculated precision, turning violence into theater, horror into a communal experience that reinforced the hierarchy and the inevitability of obedience. The act of consuming the flesh of a defeated enemy was not mindless cannibalism. It was imbued with meaning, an assertion that the victor had absorbed the strength, courage, and spirit of the fallen. For the tribe, this was both sustenance and symbolism, a dark ritual that bound the community together through shared terror and shared participation in an act that few outside the wilderness could comprehend. The horror was amplified by the environment itself. Snow-muffled sounds, creating an eerie silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the occasional desperate cry of the captured. The cold air turned breath to mist, and every movement seemed ghostly under the pale winter sun. Trees, heavy with snow, loomed like silent witnesses to the unfolding atrocities. Within this frozen theater, the warlord orchestrated his displays of power with an almost artistic sensibility, understanding that the psychological imprint of terror could outlast the physical scars of battle. Survivors, if they were spared, carried these memories for the rest of their lives, spreading tales of the warlord's cruelty far and wide. The legend of the cannibal chief grew not through exaggeration alone, but through the lived experience of fear, captured in the stories of those who narrowly escaped. But the raids were not random acts of violence. Each campaign was strategic, targeting villages whose resources, alliances, or reputations posed a threat. By striking decisively during winter, when mobility was limited and escape nearly impossible, the warlord ensured maximum effect. His forces moved like shadows over the snow, silent, efficient, and deadly. Those who resisted were eliminated swiftly, while those who surrendered were made examples, their fate woven into the narrative of terror that surrounded the warlord's name. The psychological calculus of these raids extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The wider network of tribes quickly learned that defiance meant death, that mercy was rare, and that survival required either submission or extraordinary cunning. Survivors' accounts, passed down through oral traditions, spoke of the terror in almost mythic terms. Villagers recalled the sudden disappearance of leaders, the eerie quiet that preceded an attack, and the horrifying sight of their chiefs consumed in ritualistic feasts. Traders who ventured into the region came back with stories of smoke rising over snow-covered villages, rumors of entire communities annihilated, and whispers of a warlord whose cruelty was boundless. These narratives, part legend and part reality, reinforced the warlord's dominion far beyond the immediate reach of his army. Fear became a weapon as potent as any sword or spear, and the warlord wielded it masterfully, ensuring that obedience and submission were as much a product of psychological control as military might. Despite the brutality, there was an underlying method to the madness, a careful logic to what outsiders might perceive as chaos. Each raid, each ritual, each act of consumption served a purpose: to intimidate rivals, to strengthen his tribe's cohesion, to assert dominance, and to survive in a landscape where failure meant death. In these winter campaigns, the warlord's genius became evident, not only in his tactical brilliance, but in his understanding of human fear, of the power of spectacle, and of the enduring impact of horror on collective memory. The frozen forests of Siberia, silent and white as snow fell endlessly, bore witness to acts that would echo across generations, creating a legend as chilling as the landscape itself. By the time winter ended, the warlord had not only secured resources and territory, but had further cemented his terrifying reputation. The raids, the captives, and the ritual feasts became the stuff of legend, whispered in awe and terror by those who survived and by neighboring tribes who dared not oppose him. In the endless, snowbound wilderness, power, fear, and survival were intertwined, and the warlord had mastered all three. The legend was no longer just a story. It was a living, breathing force, one that shaped behavior, dictated alliances, and ensured that the frozen lands of Siberia would forever be haunted by his presence. The warlord's reign was not built on brute force alone. Beyond the snow-laden forests and frozen rivers, he wielded something far more potent: fear. This was a fear cultivated meticulously, like a weapon honed to perfection, and it permeated every corner of his domain. Villagers, traders, and even members of his own tribe learned quickly that defiance was met not just with death, but with humiliation, punishment, and ritualized terror that would ensure their suffering would echo for generations. The warlord understood that fear was a tool as effective as a spear, as durable as a shield, and as permanent as the ice that blanketed the Siberian landscape. It was a force that required careful orchestration, for too little and his authority could be challenged, too much and it could spark rebellion. And so he calibrated it, blending horror with spectacle, obedience with terror, ensuring that every action reinforced his dominance. Within the tribe, the warlord's authority was absolute, yet it was maintained not simply by intimidation, but by creating an intricate web of loyalty, superstition, and social expectation. Members of the tribe were taught from a young age to respect and fear him, to obey not just because of personal safety, but because defiance was culturally and spiritually framed as sacrilege. Tales of his violent exploits, captured enemies, ritual feasts, and merciless winter raids were recounted in hushed tones around fires, a form of social conditioning that left an indelible mark on each listener. Children grew up internalizing the terror as a natural part of life, while adults constantly weighed their decisions against the possibility of crossing the warlord's path. Even minor infractions could result in public punishment, a spectacle designed to reinforce obedience and remind the tribe that the warlord's reach was both pervasive and inevitable. The psychological grip extended beyond his immediate followers to neighboring tribes and settlements. News of his raids traveled faster than the snow could fall. Stories emerged of villages abandoned in anticipation of his arrival, of alliances formed out of fear rather than trust, and of enemy leaders who chose submission over confrontation. The mere mention of the warlord's name could silence a council, stop a conversation, or halt a trading caravan. His reputation was a living force, as much a part of the environment as the biting wind or the frozen rivers, and it shaped behavior across vast distances. Fear was not incidental. It was the currency through which power was maintained, a perpetual cycle that ensured the warlord's authority remained unchallenged and uncontested. The warlord also understood the nuances of human psychology, exploiting vulnerabilities, insecurities, and rivalries within both his tribe and enemy communities. He fostered competition, suspicion, and distrust where it suited him, encouraging rival factions to weaken themselves before any confrontation. Those who displayed courage or cunning were co-opted or eliminated, their fates serving as lessons to others. Loyalty was rewarded, but always with a shadow of uncertainty. Nothing was guaranteed, and trust was always tempered by the possibility of punishment. By manipulating perception and controlling information, the warlord created an environment in which fear, respect, and obedience were inseparable, and in which his influence extended far beyond the reach of his immediate actions. Oral histories from survivors provide chilling insight into the depth of this psychological dominion. Tribespeople recalled the sensation of constant surveillance, the paranoia that accompanied every movement through forests, and the dread that even the quietest sounds might signal an approaching raid or a punitive expedition. Traders reported that entire caravans would reroute, avoiding territories where his scouts might be watching, altering the flow of commerce and communication simply because of the intangible terror he inspired. Within his own tribe, the warlord maintained a presence both literal and symbolic, appearing at key moments to demonstrate strength, presiding over rituals that reinforced hierarchy, and ensuring that obedience was both demanded and ritualized. Through these mechanisms, fear became institutionalized, embedded in culture and memory alike. Yet, there was a paradox in this reign of terror. The same fear that bound his followers also fostered resilience, adaptability, and cunning within the tribe. Individuals learned to navigate the tension between obedience and self-preservation, and their survival often depended on anticipating the warlord's desires before they were explicitly stated. In a landscape where death was ever-present and winter itself seemed an enemy, this balance between fear and agency defined the tribe's identity. It was not mindless submission. It was a disciplined, wary obedience born of necessity, a survival mechanism that both protected and perpetuated the warlord's authority. Stories from victims outside the tribe illustrate the far-reaching psychological impact. Rivals who survived encounters described not only the physical horror of the raids, but the lingering dread of the warlord's attention. Chiefs reported nightmares of fires in snowbound forests, of bound captives and ritual feasts, and of a figure who seemed omnipresent, watching, calculating, and judging from the shadows. Even in the absence of direct confrontation, the fear he inspired shaped decisions, alliances, and movements across the region. The warlord's mastery lay in understanding that terror could be as effective as swords and arrows, and that the mind could be conquered as decisively as any battlefield. Ultimately, the warlord's reign of fear and obedience reveals a chilling truth about power, that it is not only the ability to destroy that commands loyalty, but the ability to control perception, to manipulate the psyche, and to turn terror into a force that shapes both behavior and belief. Through a combination of brutal efficiency, ritualized horror, and psychological insight, he created a legacy that extended far beyond his immediate actions, embedding himself into the cultural memory of Siberia. It was a reign where obedience was born of terror, survival demanded vigilance, and fear became a living, breathing entity, haunting the frozen forests long after individual victims had perished. No reign of terror, no matter how meticulously orchestrated, is immune to the forces of betrayal and rivalry. The warlord, despite his absolute control over his tribe and the psychological grip he held over neighboring clans, was not invincible. Power, especially when maintained through fear and ruthlessness, inevitably breeds envy, resentment, and conspiracies. Allies who had once followed him without question began to see opportunities for their own ascension. Rivals, emboldened by whispers of dissent within the tribe, plotted in shadows, waiting for the moment when the warlord's authority might falter. In the frozen expanse of Siberia, where isolation magnified every slight and every miscalculation, even a minor lapse could trigger cascading consequences that might topple the most feared leader. The seeds of his downfall were sown in the very strategies that had once ensured his dominance. Winter raids, meticulously planned and devastatingly effective, demanded precision and loyalty. Yet repeated campaigns stretched resources thin and tested the endurance of his followers. Those tasked with executing these brutal plans began to grow weary, their resolve faltering under the relentless cold, the constant threat of death, and the weight of ritualized terror. When combined with internal rivalries, factions within the tribe that coveted influence or control, the perfect storm of discontent began to brew. Small acts of defiance, whispered conversations, and secret alliances coalesced into a formidable challenge, one that even a leader of exceptional cunning could not ignore indefinitely. Betrayal often comes from those closest to power, and the warlord was no exception. Trusted lieutenants, once loyal to the point of self-sacrifice, began to question his decisions. Some coveted his position outright, calculating that a well-timed revolt could elevate them above the legacy of terror he had created. Others were motivated by fear that his increasingly ruthless campaigns might not only destroy enemies, but also decimate their own families and villages if perceived failures occurred. In this environment, loyalty became conditional, trust a fragile commodity, and the once unified tribe began to fracture. The warlord, despite his acute understanding of human psychology, could not anticipate every betrayal. The network of fear he had cultivated began to unravel as ambition and survival instincts collided. The warlord's rivals exploited every vulnerability. Scouting parties reported false trails, Enemy villages spread misinformation, and opportunistic factions within the tribe quietly undermined his authority. Encounters that might have been straightforward victories were complicated by deceit and ambushes orchestrated by those who had once been counted as allies. Even the terrain, which had long been an ally, became treacherous in moments of miscalculation. Rivers swollen with meltwater, ice too thin to support the weight of forces, and snowstorms that obscured vision all combined to expose the warlord's campaigns to risk. His genius, which had once made him nearly untouchable, faced the cumulative weight of relentless environmental, human, and strategic pressures. The turning point came during a series of raids that should have solidified his dominance, but instead revealed the fragility of his empire. Allies faltered at critical moments, traps failed, and intelligence reached enemies who were prepared and waiting. Rivals who had endured years under his fearsome rule now saw the opportunity to strike decisively. Captured soldiers, whispers from deserters, and clandestine alliances converged into a moment that the warlord could not entirely control. What had once been a calculated demonstration of terror became a precarious gamble, where a single misstep could cascade into irreversible disaster. And in that fragile balance, the inevitability of downfall crept closer. Despite these mounting pressures, the warlord fought with the ferocity that had defined his rise. He adapted to betrayal, confronted rivals, and enacted punishments with a mixture of precision and brutality that reinforced the remnants of his authority. Yet each act of retaliation, each violent display, further strained his resources and alienated potential supporters. The psychological toll of sustaining fear, orchestrating raids, and maintaining an image of invincibility left little room for error. Even the most cunning leaders are vulnerable when surrounded by discontent, and the warlord was no exception. His empire of terror, so long untouchable, began to crumble under the weight of its own extremes. Historical accounts and oral traditions suggest that his final days were marked by a mixture of desperation and inevitability. Some describe him cornered by enemies he had long underestimated, betrayed by those who had once sworn loyalty, and forced into a series of confrontations where survival was uncertain. Others speak of a more symbolic downfall, his legend, once absolute, challenged and questioned by the very communities he had sought to dominate. In either scenario, the culmination of betrayal, rivalry, and strategic overreach reveals a timeless truth. Power maintained through fear is as fragile as ice underfoot, no matter how imposing the leader may seem. In the end, the warlord's downfall was not a sudden event, but a gradual unraveling, a complex interplay of ambition, miscalculation, and human resilience. Allies turned against him, enemies exploited every weakness, and the harsh Siberian winter, which had once served as his ally, became an indifferent witness to his decline. The legend of the warlord persisted, yet the man who had inspired terror through winter raids and ritual feasts was, in the end, mortal, vulnerable, and fallible. His story serves as a stark reminder that even the most formidable tyrants are bound by the same laws of survival, trust, and consequence that govern all human societies. Long after the warlord's reign ended, long after the fires of his ritual feasts had burned out and the snow-covered forests had reclaimed the silence, his legend endured. In the remote villages and trading posts of Siberia, his name was spoken in hushed tones, a mixture of awe and terror, a reminder of the extremes to which human beings could be driven by hunger, fear, and ambition. Stories of his raids, his ritualized consumption of enemy chiefs, and his relentless cruelty were passed down through generations, each telling amplifying the horror, until fact and myth merged into a chilling tapestry of legend. To the people who lived in the shadow of his memory, the warlord became less a man and more a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is wielded without restraint and fear is elevated into a tool of governance. The tribe itself, shaped and molded by his leadership, continued to bear the marks of his influence. Cultural rituals, social hierarchies, and survival strategies were all inextricably linked to the patterns he had established. Fear had been institutionalized. Obedience had become ritualized. Even after his death or disappearance, the survivors followed the codes he had created, ensuring that his legacy persisted in both memory and practice. Young members of the tribe grew up learning the stories, internalizing the lessons, and understanding that the past was never truly gone. The warlord had become a foundational figure, his actions and principles embedded into the identity of the community, shaping not only survival but morality, ethics, and social cohesion in ways that would resonate for generations. Beyond the immediate confines of his tribe, the warlord's influence reached far into the surrounding regions. Neighboring clans and distant settlements recounted encounters with his forces, retold the horrors of winter raids, and described the psychological grip he held over people far beyond his immediate control. Traders traveling across Siberia would change their routes, avoiding territories where his scouts might be present. Chiefs of rival tribes spoke of him as a ghostly force, capable of striking with precision, cunning, and an almost supernatural awareness of human behavior. These narratives, grounded in both lived experience and the embellishments of oral tradition, reinforced the perception that the warlord's power was eternal, his presence lingering like a shadow over the frozen land. Historians attempting to separate fact from myth face a formidable challenge. Records are sparse, accounts are often contradictory, and oral histories have evolved over centuries, merging fear, admiration, and narrative invention. Yet a consistent theme emerges. The warlord's reign represented a convergence of survival, strategy, and psychological mastery. His acts, no matter how horrifying, were deliberate, serving multiple purposes simultaneously, securing resources, asserting dominance, instilling fear, and reinforcing cultural cohesion. In this way, he became a case study in the intersection of environment, necessity, and human cruelty, demonstrating how extreme circumstances can produce figures whose impact resonates far beyond their lifetime. The legend also illuminates the human fascination with horror. Tales of his ritualized cannibalism, the gruesome spectacle of captured chiefs, and the calculated terror he inflicted upon both his followers and enemies continue to captivate historians, writers, and storytellers. There is a macabre allure to the extremes of human behavior, a curiosity about the psychological mechanisms that enable someone to command fear so completely. This fascination is not merely voyeuristic. It provides insight into the ways in which culture, environment, and necessity shape morality, leadership, and societal norms. The warlord, through his actions, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about survival, ethics, and the thin lines separating human resilience from monstrous behavior. In many ways, the warlord became a mythic figure precisely because of the contradictions he embodied. He was both destroyer and protector, tyrant and leader, feared yet revered. Within the tribe, he provided order and ensured survival, while outside, he was a force of terror and death. This duality made him unforgettable, a figure whose story could be told as both history and legend. His legacy was not simply the violence he enacted, but the lessons, sometimes cautionary, sometimes horrifying, that emerged from the complex interplay of fear, loyalty, and survival. He demonstrated the power of myth to extend influence beyond mortal limits, showing that reputation and psychological mastery can rival swords, arrows, and armies in shaping human history. Even centuries later, the frozen landscapes of Siberia carry whispers of his presence. Folktales describe ghostly figures wandering the forests, watching from the shadows, enforcing the lessons learned through generations of oral storytelling. Young children were warned not to wander alone in winter, lest they encounter the lingering spirit of the warlord or his scouts. These stories, steeped in cultural memory, ensure that the warlord's legend persists, not merely as a historical footnote, but as a living, breathing force embedded in the identity of the people and the memory of the land itself. Ultimately, the legacy of the warlord is a chilling reminder of the extremes of human behavior, the enduring power of fear, and the ability of myth to preserve memory. His reign of terror, brutal raids, and ritualized feasts shaped not only his tribe but the entire region, leaving an indelible mark on Siberian history. Even in the absence of contemporary records, the fusion of story, memory, and legend ensures that the warlord's presence remains as formidable and haunting as the frozen forests where he once ruled, a testament to the enduring fascination and horror of humanity's darkest chapters. As the echoes of the warlord's reign faded into history, the frozen forests of Siberia remained, silent witnesses to acts of horror that challenged the boundaries of human understanding. The story of the cannibalistic warlord and his tribe is not merely one of cruelty and violence. It is a testament to the extremes of human survival, the fragility of morality under pressure, and the terrifying power of fear when wielded as a tool of control. To study his life is to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which environment, scarcity, and culture can converge to produce acts that are at once horrifying and understandable. In the relentless winters, where starvation was constant and death lurked in every shadow, choices were often binary: dominate or be destroyed, obey or perish, act ruthlessly or die. Within this crucible, the warlord emerged, not as an anomaly, but as a manifestation of the harsh realities of his time and place. The lessons of his story extend beyond the realm of historical curiosity. They speak to the universality of fear as a mechanism of power. The warlord's genius lay not merely in his martial skill, but in his understanding of psychology, in his ability to make terror tangible and immediate. Fear became his sword, his shield, and his language, allowing him to govern, to conquer, and to manipulate without always lifting a hand in violence. This is a lesson as old as civilization itself. Human behavior can be guided, constrained, and reshaped by perception as much as by force. Communities, allies, and enemies all adjusted their actions according to the projected threat of the warlord, demonstrating that reputation and legend can become instruments of influence as potent as any physical weapon. At the same time, the warlord's story underscores the danger of absolute power maintained through terror. His eventual downfall, brought on by betrayal, overreach, and the fractures within his own tribe, illustrates a timeless truth. Fear can only sustain authority for so long. Human loyalty, no matter how conditioned, has limits. Rivalries, envy, and survival instincts inevitably emerge, especially under pressure. In this sense, the warlord's life is both a cautionary tale and a historical mirror, reflecting the delicate balance between dominance and vulnerability, between terror and sustainability. Even the most formidable leader, when surrounded by discontent or miscalculation, becomes susceptible to collapse, demonstrating that the exercise of fear as a governing principle carries inherent instability. There is also a moral complexity embedded in his narrative. While modern audiences may instinctively judge the warlord as monstrous, it is crucial to consider the environmental and cultural context that shaped his actions. Siberia's unforgiving winters, the scarcity of food, and the constant threat of rival tribes created a world in which extreme measures were often necessary for survival. The ritual consumption of enemy chiefs, though horrifying to contemporary sensibilities, was entangled with symbolism, strategy, and sustenance. It was a form of psychological warfare, a display of dominance, and, at times, an assertion of life over death in a land where mortality was omnipresent. Understanding this does not excuse the atrocities, but it provides insight into how human behavior is molded by circumstance, and how survival and power can drive individuals to unimaginable extremes. The warlord's story also resonates as a reflection on human resilience. Both his tribe and those who survived his raids adapted, endured, and, in some cases, resisted. Fear did not always lead to submission. It inspired cunning, ingenuity, and the development of survival strategies. Villagers learned to anticipate attacks, rivals devised countermeasures, and even within the tribe, individuals navigated the tension between loyalty and self-preservation. These dynamics illustrate the duality of fear. It is simultaneously a tool of oppression and a catalyst for adaptation, a force that can dominate, but also provoke resourcefulness and resilience in those subjected to it. Moreover, the legend of the warlord endures because it engages with a fundamental human fascination, the allure of darkness and the extremes of morality. Stories of ritualized violence, cannibalistic feasts, and cold, calculated terror capture our attention because they force us to confront the boundaries of what it means to be human. They challenge assumptions, evoke empathy and revulsion simultaneously, and compel reflection on how environmental pressures, social structures, and psychological mechanisms intersect to produce both cruelty and survival. The warlord, in his extreme embodiment of these forces, becomes a lens through which we can explore not only history, but the psychology of power and the human condition itself. Finally, his story is a meditation on legacy and memory. Even centuries later, the frozen landscapes bear the imprint of his actions, preserved in oral tradition, folklore, and cultural memory. His reign demonstrates that actions, particularly those that inspire awe and terror, can outlast mortality, becoming symbols, myths, and lessons that endure long after the individual has vanished. The warlord's influence extended far beyond his lifespan, shaping the behavior, rituals, and identities of communities that survived him, reminding us that human history is often defined as much by stories and legends as by concrete events. In the end, the frozen horror of Siberia teaches a sobering lesson, that human nature, when pressed to extremes, can produce both terror and ingenuity, cruelty and adaptation, fear and survival. The warlord's life is a testament to these extremes, a mirror reflecting both the darkness and resilience embedded in humanity. His story lingers in memory and myth, a chilling yet fascinating study of power, fear, and survival, reminding us that even in the coldest, most desolate landscapes, human ambition and horror can leave a mark that endures for centuries, haunting the imagination long after the snow has melted.